Here's a new video in history for the Première syllabus of the British International section, and we are still in theme 3, which is about France and Britain from 1870 to World War I. So that's connected to a part of the French syllabus which only focuses on the Third Republic as a parliamentary regime and a colonial empire. And so in the British section, I believe it was pertinent to provide you with a comparison between France and Britain. And so in this video we start lesson number 2, which is about colonialism. And so the title is Colonial Empires at Their Peak, because indeed I believe that this period of the pre-World War I period was probably, at least for Britain, some kind of a peak of colonialism. So I believe the first thing that must be done is a couple of definitions. Colonial empires were really important characteristics of world history, and in particular in the 19th century and first part of the 20th. But what does it mean exactly? Empire is a very widely used term in politics and geopolitics all over the world, and that is not new. There were already empires back in antiquity, the Roman Empire being the most famous example. So we could define an empire as a state, okay, and I send you to a previous lesson for the definition of a state, but a state that works as an aggregate of several nations under the domination of one central power. Okay, so this is what the Roman Empire used to be. You have different peoples, we would not call them nations back in antiquity, like you know, Egyptians, people from Gaul, the Greeks, etc. That all belong to a political entity dominated by Rome. This also applies to the empires that France and Britain built during their history. A colony is also a term that used to exist in antiquity and which mostly referred to an overseas territory living under the domination and according to the administration of a foreign power. Okay, so for example, Australia used to be a colony of Britain during the 19th century. And so definition of a colonial empire would be something like a state that works as an aggregate of overseas territories living under the domination of a foreign power. So why is it interesting and important to study colonialism? And I chose this picture, which is a French postcard from 1904, as an illustration of this. And I hope that you feel when watching this postcard that there are some important issues linked to colonization, obviously. I believe that what is particularly interesting about colonialism is that it was, by definition, a relation of domination of some peoples by other peoples, and that form of domination implied a certain degree of racism, precisely because people living in a colony, native people from a colony, were seen really as alien people because of the overseas dimension. And well, this racism is made particularly obvious on this postcard, where we have the impression, and I think it corresponds to real facts, that some human beings are treated like objects, as animals, and certainly as inferior beings than the people who made the picture and sold it and bought it. Even though this was, of course, absolutely not the case, and that the shame should probably be on the people that used that picture more than on the people that were pictured on it. Anyway, so that experience of domination with a degree of racism is an experience that has concerned, in one way or another, almost all the peoples of the world. Almost all the countries of the world have been, at one point of their history at least, either a colonial power having colonies or a colonized area. So it's a universal story, in fact, colonialism. That makes it very interesting, I think. Another point which is interesting is about the history of European colonialism of the 19th and 20th century, is that it changed the world, really. Because it led to a certain Europeanization of the world. We can say that this Europeanization of the world really started with the so-called discovery of America by Columbus in 1492, which was followed by waves of conquest and colonization, firstly by Spain and Portugal, later by Britain, France, the Netherlands, etc. Conquest of lands, mostly in America, also a bit in Africa and Asia, which led to the spreading of, well, for example, European languages, European religions. Christianity is still today by far the most important religion all over America. This conquest also led to many rebellions, and most of the colonies became independent later. So colonization was also a very important motor of world history. For all these reasons, I believe this is a very interesting and important issue in history. Now, let's compare two maps of European colonial empires at two different points. Unfortunately, I did not find a map of colonial empires by 1870. But in fact, it's not a problem. We can take the bigger picture and first have a look at the map of colonial empires by the very beginning of the 19th century. And as you can see here, colonization used to concern mostly the Americas. And at the beginning of the 19th century, the most important colonial empires were still the Spanish colonial empire and the Portuguese one. The Portuguese were present in what is today Brazil, but also had some coastal lands in Africa and Asia. And that corresponded, something you study in second, to an old division of the world between Spain and Portugal that was chosen a little bit after the discovery of America. Some other European countries, so the UK and France in particular, were also present in these continents. But you see clearly, outside of America, the colonial areas were mostly some trading posts which were very coastal in Africa and Asia. Only small areas administered, often by a foreign company more than a foreign country actually, but we'll see that a bit later. And now if we look at the map at the end of the period studied in this lesson, so the colonial empires, just at the outbreak of World War I, we see a totally different world. First of all, we can observe a shift, as most of America was then decolonized and had reached a certain independence, apart from the Guyanas and some islands in the Caribbean. And we can see that now the colonized continent by excellence was Africa, and large parts of Asia as well. So clearly something happened in the period in this lesson, and what happened was a new wave of colonialism that involved almost all the Western European countries, that accelerated their conquest of the world, and to the point that it reached a certain peak, as by 1914, well, most of the world was under European domination. Even China, even though it's not seen on this map, because China was a bit different. All European powers had a certain influence on China, but the state of China still survived. So anyway, we are really with this period at a key moment of the history of colonialism in the world. And there will be three parts in the lesson. I will examine three issues in this lesson about the British and French empires. Conquest, then propaganda, and then colonialism and how it worked really on the ground, what kind of governance existed, what kind of societies were created in the colonies. So the first part is about conquest, and I also want to examine why conquest happened, so the factors of conquest. And in this first video, I will only develop part 1A, which is a summary of the situation before the 1870s. A time when European conquest of some parts of the world was mostly due to the will to trade and to improve international trade. Both Britain and France had conquered and administered colonies before the 1870s. And a good example, maybe the oldest example of European colonialism, was the Caribbean area, so in Central America. Following the examples of Spain and Portugal that had started in the 16th century to colonize that part of the world, Britain and France had conquered and administered some colonies that still remained in the area. So that is a map of a political map of the Caribbean by 1865. You can see on this map that quite a few states had become independent from Spain already, often with the help of the United States of America. And nevertheless, some British colonies still remained. So you can see them in golden orange here, like the Bahamas in the north, this archipelago, like Jamaica, quite in the middle of the map, and also some British islands in the Antilles. France was less present, but still had Guadeloupe and Martinique, also in the archipelago of the Antilles in the east. And most of these islands, which were the oldest colonies at the time, were administered and exploited for some raw materials, natural resources, and in particular sugar. Clearly the industry of sugar, which used to imply slave labor. It was not the case anymore at that moment in the British and French colonies, but This is a very important issue that was studied in second. So the exploitation of sugar was the main reason for European domination of some lands here. This leads me to the main factors. What were the main factors of this first colonization of some lands by European powers? I think there were two main factors for both France and Britain, and also the others. The first one was this access to some specific resources that was seen as a necessity or an opportunity, and so it's an economic factor. And we could also add in this economic dimension, economic reason for colonization, the will, in particular for Britain, to control some strategic points of global trade. That's the reason why the British had control on Singapore, for example, in Eastern Asia, which was a key spot in the maritime routes of Eastern Asia. That's also the reason why the British had a great interest in the Suez Canal, which was dug in the 1860s and connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. And the other factor, in addition to this economic factor, was a political factor, because there was already a competition for international power among the European countries. So these two factors, the economic and the political one, would be permanent and also explain colonization after the 1870s. That is a very important point. Now, truth must be told, Britain had a real leadership by the middle of the 19th century. An expression used to say that Britannia, so Britannia is the allegory that you can see here at the center of this propaganda poster from the 1860s, or is it 1880s? I'm not sure, I must admit. Anyway, so Britannia used to rule the waves. It was the expression used in those days. Britain was by far the country with the largest international influence. And I think three reasons explain that British domination, that British advance. The first reason is that Britain was an island power, and for that reason it soon developed a very powerful navy. Okay. The other point is that Britain had enjoyed a real political stability throughout the 19th century. It was a strong state, a sound state, and that helped, of course, this colonization. And the third and maybe most important of all was the Industrial Revolution that affected Britain before any other country in the world. And that gave it, an advance on all the other powers of the world regarding technology in particular. So in other words, Britain's leadership was explained by a combination of financial power and firepower. And what made this area of British colonial domination absolutely exceptional was not only the fact that it was rather global, but also the specific domination of the Indian subcontinent, a very populated and very rich in resources area, which really made a difference with all the other empires in the world. And this also was true throughout the period that we study in this lesson. A name, an expression, or more exactly a motto that became famous at the end of the 19th century was that the British Empire was the empire on which the sun never sets. It remained very famous. But before the 1870s, in fact, this empire did not have a name yet. It was not named the British Empire, really. The reason for that is that it was not the result of a strongly structured strategy, but rather of a kind of improvisation. And I would like to quote a British historian about the British Empire. He said that the empire had been conquered in a fit of absence of mind. That's a quote by Niall Ferguson. And it's rather true that it did not correspond to a very structured plan. In fact, the main actors of colonization by Britain before the 1870s was the merchants. People that wanted to trade and find trade opportunities in other parts of the world. The best example of these traders is the East India Company. So that was a company which had been given by the British Crown a monopoly, which means a total control, on trading in India. So the trade notably concerned cotton and silk in those days. And this East India Company managed to impose itself in large areas of India with the support of the Royal Navy and the British military power when necessary. And the East India Company, in a way, developed its own army, mostly composed of natives, as shown on this picture, where you can see the governor of the East India Company, who was in fact the actual governor of British India at that time. Things changed in 1857, where many Indian states, you can see on this map which states in India were under British domination, under the domination of the East India Company, when a big revolt broke out, in fact consisting often of soldiers, native soldiers, that rebelled against their British officers, which was very scary for the East India Company and for Britain, which had understood the great interest of having control over India. And so after this rebellion of 1857, the control of India was transferred from the East India Company to the Crown, to the Queen, that is to say, to the state. An expression was coined, British Raj, which refers to this British rule of India. A flag was created, and on this map of India in 1858, you can see in pink the Indian provinces directly governed by the British, and the states which were still named the princely states, which mean that local princes still had the authority on these areas in yellow, even though they were allied to Britain. Now, in most cases, apart from India, Britain's domination was only on small coastal territories. A good example of that is the relation with China and the example of Hong Kong. So the British merchants wanted to trade with China as well. And in those days, the Chinese Empire used to be a rather closed country. It was not really open to foreign trade. Nevertheless, the British managed to enter the Chinese market, and in particular with one product that they made in India, which was opium. So a very dangerous drug, which in 1842 was banned by the Chinese emperor. He did not want the British to sell opium in China anymore because he believed it was dangerous for his country. And this led to the First Opium War, which is an incredible event because it's a war that was fought by the British Navy, and a quick victory because of the huge firepower of Britain, in order to impose to China to buy opium. So you see, the power of the British state, British army, was here in order to impose the British notion of free trade with China. That's an interesting point because, you know, in free trade you are supposed to believe that you are free to trade or not. Well, in the British colonial vision of that, free trade was something you could impose to another country, and this is what happened with the First Opium War. And it was a British victory, and so the treaty that put an end to that war led to the fact that Hong Kong was given to the British. So this map, in fact, concerns British Hong Kong a bit later, not in 1842, but never mind. It's just, for me, an opportunity to show to you where Hong Kong is, and to make you understand that what interested the British was not dominating all China. They knew they could not do that, but they wanted to keep control and develop this port, because for them Hong Kong would be a kind of gateway to China, and that was very, very important. Another point of the British colonial empire before the 1870s was the specificity that Britain had many colonies of white settlement. And you can see some of them represented on this poster with an interesting motto. It's about World War I, but I use it at that point. And you can see Australia, Canada, and Cape, which refers to South Africa. They were colonies where an emigration of British people had been encouraged by governments. Canada or Australia in particular were areas, large areas, which were considered by the British to be in a way empty. They were not totally empty. Some peoples, some natives used to live there and often died with contact with the European, either killed by murder or by diseases, and if not killed, oppressed. But anyway, emigration to, for example, New South Wales, which is in the southeast of Australia, was strongly encouraged, and you can understand why it was encouraged. It was also because in the 19th century there was an overpopulation in Britain due to the demographic boom that happened at that moment. And well, that is that emigration of British people in Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, and also in South Africa, is very, very important historical event if you look at the world today. The cost of this colonization was rather low for the British monarchy, because in fact, in these conditions, the money used for conquest was almost only private money, private capital invested by rich people who tried to make profit in the colonial adventures. That always remained an important principle of British colonization. It had to be rather cheap and economically profitable. And this was the main motor of British colonization. The greed, the will to invest and win money of some British investors, more than really a policy demanded and conceived by the government. And the result of that is that there was a certain important export of British money, of British capital in less developed regions of the world. That's a fact. Now, another thing must be said very quickly is about France at that moment. Well, France was far behind. Britain. France already had some lands in different continents of the world, but much smaller than Britain. And as a colony of white settlement, it only had Algeria, which had been conquered in 1830. This is the only place where emigration of white people was encouraged. But this emigration was less important because France was not overpopulated. And under Napoleon III, some lands in Asia were also conquered, and in particular the south of Vietnam. But before the period of new imperialism that I will explore in the following video, we can say that the British advance was really remarkable in colonization.